William Ashley was in his mid-20s when he arrived in what we call Missouri. This was before Missouri was Missouri. We're talking like 1802, 1803, so even before the Louisiana Purchase was negotiated, he was in that area. And he made his fortune there, among other things, manufacturing gunpowder. Well, fast forward to the War of 1812, and William Ashley is fighting for the Missouri militia. He advances to the rank of brigadier general. Fast forward a few more years, and Missouri is admitted to the Union as a state in its own right, and William Ashley serves as its very first lieutenant governor. That's 1820 to 1824. And it's while he's serving in that office that he decides to team up with an associate of his, a fellow entrepreneur named Andrew Henry. Andrew Henry was a bullet maker. He was also a miner, just like Ashley was, and he was involved in other things. He had fur trade experience. He worked for the Missouri Fur Company for a while. So these guys team up, and they post an advertisement in the Missouri Gazette. And the advertisement calls for 100 enterprising young men. That's the verbiage used in the advertisement. 100 enterprising young men. These 100 enterprising young men will advance up the Missouri to its source, where they will work for 1, 2, or 3 years. So that's what the advertisement says. And those who respond to the advertisement, these enterprising young men, they are young men, will come to be known as Ashley's 100. Ashley's 100. And among them are several future famous mountain men. Men like Hugh Glass. If you've seen the Leonardo DiCaprio movie, The Revenant, that is loosely based on Hugh Glass's life. Or Jedediah Smith, the great mountain man Jedediah Smith. Or Jim Bridger, possibly the most significant, historically speaking, mountain man of all. All these guys are young men making up part of Ashley's 100. By early 1823, Ashley's operation has moved north and west along the Missouri into Arikara country, where I am. The Arikara, this is a Caddoan-speaking Great Plains nation, related to the Pawnee, probably broke off from the Pawnee sometime in the 1400s. So related to the Pawnee. Now they live here, and they live in mostly fixed villages. We could call them semi-nomadic. They hunted the buffalo. The villages changed location from time to time. But they lived in mostly fixed villages because they relied upon corn. They were agriculturalists. They relied upon corn more than anything else. The Arikara. Well, the Arikara, and there's about 30,000 of them, spread out over 30 villages on the west bank of the Missouri. But then they come into contact with Lewis and Clark. Lewis and Clark actually stop here on their famous expedition and trade with the Arikaras. And the Arikaras learn, as more explorers follow in Lewis and Clark's footsteps and follow suit, trading with the Arikaras learn that in addition to hunting the buffalo and growing corn, they can trade furs for European goods, for American goods. And so they do. They become sort of a middleman. They perfect that. They come to control much of the fur trade along the Missouri. As middlemen, trading for furs, they pay natives further west for furs, and then they turn around and trade those for more eastern goods as traders show up here. But that contact comes with a price, a great price actually. That contact comes with smallpox. A smallpox outbreak here ends up devastating the Arikaras, and that population of 30,000 dwindles to 5,000 or 6,000 by the time Ashley's group shows up here, spread out over just 5 or 6 villages. Now the Arikara have dealt with traders before, of course, and they've gotten used to it. But Ashley's group, Ashley's 100, this is a company of a different sort, in the sense that they want to trade with the Arikara too, but they want to trade for horses. They want to procure their own furs. In other words, they are direct competition. Okay, and surely they had ambitions of coming to control the fur trade in this area, along this part of the Missouri. So direct competition. So there's our first complicating factor. Second, it didn't help that recently a group of Missouri Fur Company men, so completely disconnected, not associated with Ashley's 100, but whites, had gotten into a scuffle with some Arikaras, and 2 Arikara warriors had been killed. Okay, to the Arikaras, these white traders are sometimes, or often, or usually all lumped together. Third, you have the fact that years before, an Arikara chief had been invited to Washington, D.C., and on his way home, he happened to die. But the Arikaras had always suspected murder. In fact, they'd always just considered it to have been a case of murder. It was a wrong assertion. It was incorrect, but that was their thinking nonetheless. So there's another complicating factor. And then we can throw in the claim that some historians make that Ashley had refused to build a trading post nearby for exclusive trading with the Arikara. A trading post had recently been built for exclusive trading with the Lakota, the Arikara's sworn enemy. They hated the Lakota. But William Ashley won't build a trading post for exclusive trading with the Arikara. So all these things come together to create sort of a perfect storm of misunderstanding. None of which probably, or at least very little of which, Ashley's 100 would have even been aware of when they showed up here. Now they camped on the beach of the Missouri, just a little ways from here, and for 3 days they traded with the Arikara. Again, they're trading for horses, but the Arikara, over the course of those 3 days, are trading for guns and ammunition. On the third night, 2 of Ashley's men snuck out of camp. Apparently, according to one eyewitness, they did so without permission. Without permission, that's the language used. They sneak out of camp and they sneak into one of the Arikara villages. Apparently they were seeking female companionship. Well, one of these guys ends up dead. His body so mangled that reportedly the Arikara refused to give it up. Then, on June 2nd, the Arikara strike Ashley's camp there on the beach. And it's a massacre. I'll let the words of one eyewitness describe what it was like.
You will easily perceive that we had little else to do than to stand on a bare sandbar and be shot at long range. There being 700 or 800 guns in the village, and we having the day previously furnished them with an abundance of powder and ball.
Well, 12 to 15 of Ashley's 100 are cut down in the massacre. 12 to 15 die. The rest are able to run away off that bloody beach and find some sort of hiding place in the wilderness. Hugh Glass will later describe the whole affair as perplexing because, as he put it, they'd traded for the last 3 days as friends. That's the way he put it, as friends. Anyway, they hide in the wilderness for weeks before they finally, these survivors, sort of get the guts to come out and make their way along that arduous path to Fort Atkinson, the safety of a U.S. Army fort in modern-day Nebraska. Well, when the details of the attack are made known to federal authorities at Fort Atkinson and to the local federal Indian agent, it's decided that a military response is required. And so on June 22nd, 1823, Colonel Henry Leavenworth, this is a veteran of the Battle of Niagara, the War of 1812. He is the 6th Infantry Regiment commander. He leaves Fort Atkinson June 22nd, so that's 20 days after the massacre. He leaves the fort to embark upon that 650-mile journey here into Arikara country to engage the Arikaras in battle. 230 men, 650 miles, plus artillery. He has artillery as well. Well, his force balloons in size along the way when Joshua Pilcher and the men he's brought rendezvous with him. So who is Joshua Pilcher? Joshua Pilcher is the head of the Missouri Fur Company. So you might ask, what the heck is the head of the Missouri Fur Company doing going along on this force to teach the Arikaras a lesson? Well, you be the judge. But, we might say that he was genuinely concerned for the safety and welfare of fellow trappers like himself. Or, more cynically, we might say that maybe he's looking to move in on Rocky Mountain Fur Company territory. Of course, he runs a rival outfit. But whatever the case, he's been recruiting among the Lakota. So he's brought 60 armed trappers, but he's also brought 750 Lakota warriors. 750 Lakota warriors. So now the army that Leavenworth is leading is actually mostly Sioux, mostly Lakota. The Lakota, you'll remember, are the traditional and hated enemies of the Arikaras. The Lakota for years have been pushing the Arikaras slowly off of their territory. Mounted Lakota warriors routinely raided Arikara territory, routinely picked off Arikara warriors, and routinely kidnapped Arikara children. So the Arikaras hate them, and the Lakotas are more than happy to take Pilcher up on his offer to raid and pillage the Arikaras yet again. Well, this coalition army reaches the vicinity of the Arikara villages, in fact, right around here, in early August. By the way, by now the coalition army is calling itself the Missouri Legion, styling itself the Missouri Legion. Anyway, the Missouri Legion gets here, and Leavenworth finds that these Arikara villages, far from being out in the open, are actually quite well defended. So the Arikaras are quite adept at defending themselves against a mobile enemy, namely the Lakotas. And so their cornfields are surrounded by wooden fences, and their village propers are surrounded by big earth and wood palisades. In fact, one of the Americans on the scene will describe them and essentially say that the Sioux and the Arikaras had been at war with each other for so long that the Arikaras picketed themselves in. Anyway, so he's got defenses that he has to break down. Well, the Lakota are sent in first. The Lakota charge, this Lakota cavalry, but they're beaten back by the defenders. Don't forget that the Arikaras have recently been stocked with guns and ammunition by Ashley's 100. So they're able to push the Lakota back. Meanwhile, Leavenworth has surrounded the villages with artillery, and now he lets loose a barrage of that firepower. It wears down the defenses a bit, but they don't fall, they hold. Next, the infantry goes in, the U.S. Army, but they're driven back by the defenders. So, Leavenworth unable to take the villages immediately. However, this constant attack wears down the Arikaras enough that they are, in effect, driven to the negotiation table. But the negotiations go poorly. It doesn't help that on the American Lakota side, people are divided as to what sort of tone to strike. Well, Pilcher, for one, he wants the Arikara completely subdued, pacified. He wants complete submission. And Leavenworth, for his part, he's more accommodationist. He wants to strike a conciliatory tone and hope that that can facilitate accommodation on both sides. So, anyway, the negotiations don't go well, and on August 14th, the Arikara escape anyway. They escape from their villages. They run north into the refuge of their allies, the Siouan-speaking Mandan and Hidatsa, in what is today northern South Dakota and in North Dakota. So they're gone. So they, in effect, abandon the negotiations. Well, Leavenworth sort of throws up his hands and says, you know what? I think we've taught them a lesson. They're going to think twice before attacking fur traders again. Let's go home. And so he marches his men back to Fort Atkinson. Pilcher is seething that Leavenworth is so accommodationist, that he just went home. And so Pilcher leads his men into the abandoned Arikara villages and burns them to the ground. Now Leavenworth, he's angry, very angry, when he finds out what Pilcher had done, but at that point the damage had been done. It's too late to do anything really about it. And when the Arikaras return to their villages the next year, they find nothing but ashes. Well, despite a rebuilding effort in 1824, and despite a peace treaty with the United States, between the United States and the Arikaras in 1825, eventually the Arikaras are driven out of here. But not by the U.S. military, rather by the Lakota, a constant Lakota onslaught. See, the Lakota never stopped fighting the Arikaras. The U.S. military intervention here, the reaction to the massacre of some of Ashley's 100, that could be seen as, U.S. aid to the Lakota war effort. But in any case, it's the Lakotas that drive the Arikaras from this territory for good. And it's interesting, I'm standing on a Sioux reservation, a Lakota reservation here in South Dakota. So this area still is Lakota. It's still Sioux. The Arikaras are gone. They're much further north. They opt to remain permanently with their Hidatsa and Mandan allies, where their descendants can still be found today. The disparate attitudes of Leavenworth, an accommodationist on the one hand, and Pilcher, a guy who wanted to exterminate the Arikaras, or at least completely subdue them, on the other, perhaps represents the divided attitudes of Americans at the time and for decades afterwards when it comes to the American Indian problem, the perceived American Indian problem. In other words, the presence of American Indian bands and nations and groups who could, from time to time, actually be violent. I mean, what do you do? What's the reaction? What's the proper reaction to that? One of my pet peeves is when people treat large groups as if they think in hive mind, as if they're just one big block. White society was not one big block. It was very divided, often heatedly so, on questions like this. So there was not one single response here. The state will tend towards a more uniform response, but that has more to do with the nature of the state, I think. But in any case, different responses among whites on how to deal with and relate to and treat the various American Indian groups. And the same goes for the American Indians. This is not one big block of people. Among the American Indians, there are accommodationists. There are those who are for adaptation. And there are others who opt for a more violent path. And just a few days before the Arikaras killed a bunch of Ashley's men, further west on the Yellowstone River, a bunch of fur traders of the Missouri Fur Company had been killed by a group of Blackfoot. So these things did happen. The question was, how do you respond to these things? And why did they happen, and how do you respond? And American Indians were divided. Whites were divided. And of course, there are American Indians who continue to view the U.S. military as a potential ally against their own native enemies. Much the same way that some of those original settlers, French, Spanish, English, Dutch, were viewed by those East Coast natives as potential allies against their local native traditional enemies. Meanwhile, there's other American Indian bands that will continue to conquer and displace and exterminate and enslave, push out other American Indian peoples. So it's mixed. It's a hodgepodge. It's muddy. History's muddy. History's complicated. History's rarely black and white. Dude, I'm in quicksand. Ooh. I'm in quicksand. Oh boy. Oh boy. Look at these holes. Look at my shoes. Yeah. Muddy. I just said history was muddy. Ha ha! Wow. Object lesson for you, students. History is muddy. Whew! In any case, let me just finish. The Arikara War of 1823, up to that point, represented, oh my gosh, my legs are completely heavy. But anyway, the Arikara War of 1823, up to that point, represented by far the westernmost of the Indian wars up to that point. And that's a sort of an ominous harbinger of things to come, maybe. And as for the Arikaras, they would never fight the U.S. military again, but they have another major role to play in greater American history. But that's another story. If you're interested in taking a deeper dive into history, consider one of my full courses, each including something like 400 plus pages of text, 30 plus hours of audio, 50, 60, 70 on-location videos filmed all over the world, plus all the scaffolding you could ask for should you want to take it like a traditional student. We're talking guided notes, both blank and filled, quizzes, structure training, document lessons. These really are unique and one of a kind. Check them out. Also, if you want to support what I do here, consider joining Nomad Nation, where you'll gain exclusive access to monthly webinars, Q&A, a monthly newsletter called Nomad Notes, special live stream events from all over the world. I'll send you 4 postcards a year, discounts. Go check all this out at nomadicprofessor.com.